We are glad and thankful that you are able to be here with us this morning. If you are a guest, we'd invite you to be back with us any opportunity that you have available. I'm excited for today, this Lord's Day, but also looking forward to next Sunday as well, having Mother's Day. And certainly we have plenty of reasons to celebrate the mothers that we've had in our lives, grandmothers, and those who have been like mothers to us. But we look forward to that. We invite you to be back with us next week as well as we focus upon our mothers and even have a message about them as well. This morning, if you haven't already, you can turn your Bibles to Mark chapter 3. Mark chapter 3. It's been interesting to follow along with Jesus in this ministry of His, in the gospel, to see all the different things that's happened in His life. You can almost imagine being a first century person during this time and living in this area, and you start hearing about the stories that are coming out of Jerusalem and Judea and Galilee and around the Sea of Galilee and all the things that are going on. And you start hearing about these works that this man named Jesus is doing, and we might have a word for that we might use, and we might say that it was strange. It sounds a little strange what's coming out of the mouth of these people. And if you even saw some of the events, some of the miracles that Jesus performed, you might say, well, that's kind of strange. It just isn't something normal that we would see from day to day. And when we see something strange, it sometimes maybe takes a little time to decide what we think about it, how we feel about it, and what we're going to do. That was also true for some of the people we read about here in our text in Mark chapter 3. In Mark chapter 3, we see basically three different audiences here. Three different, we might say, individuals. The first group that we see here with Jesus, and it was the group that was with Him most of the time, that were His disciples. And here in chapter 3, after Jesus has taught in the synagogue and He healed in the synagogue, some of the audience decided they wanted to kill Him. They wanted to destroy Him. They wanted to ruin His reputation and even wanted to see Him physically die. And it's in that context that verse 7 says, "But Jesus withdrew with His disciples to the sea." The disciples here are those who are committed to Jesus Christ. Now, we might think many strange things of what the Bible has to say. The Bible may say something that just doesn't sound normal to us. It may sound kind of contradictory to what we know and what we believe. But we have to be willing, like the disciples, to be committed to Jesus. Now, in what way were they committed? Well, as we've already seen and said, during this time, Jesus had those who were seeking to do Him physical harm. And it wasn't just any group, it was the group that had the most influence. It was the group that was probably the most popular at the time, being the Pharisees, but even also there in verse 6, the Herodians. Those who had the backing of the Romans, those who sided with the Romans. So what Jesus was doing was upsetting some pretty influential people. And when you got on their bad side, it wasn't going to be good for you. But the disciples here still followed Jesus. If we are going to be committed disciples of Jesus, if we're going to be the ones who look at Jesus and say, you know what, I want to be with Him, I want to live with Him, I want to be saved by Him, we have to show a willingness to follow Him. But the disciples here didn't just follow Him somewhere, they followed Him anywhere. They followed Him wherever He went. Whether it was walking into a synagogue, into hostile territory, where there were Pharisees, Sadducees, Herodians, and other groups who wanted to see Him die, they followed Him. They followed Him to the Garden of Gethsemane. They followed Him all the way up to the point until He was to be crucified. And at that point, He told them, you know what? No one's going to follow me. I'm going at this by myself. You may say you want to, but I know that you will not. And at that point, they did break their commitment. But afterwards, they renewed their commitment to God. They renewed their urgency to follow Jesus wherever He would lead them. To follow Jesus simply means that we are being led by Him. We are following His Word. We are following where He leads us and where He directs us to go, what He directs us to say and to do and to teach. We follow Him not just somewhere, we follow Him anywhere He leads us. And at this point, He has led them down by the sea. They were also committed to Jesus in that they kept Him center stage. When they got down to the Sea of Galilee, we noticed that there was a great multitude that followed Him and followed from Galilee. There were some from Judea. There was some from Jerusalem. There was some from Idumea. And beyond the Jordan, there was those from Tyre and Sidon. Basically, the area He's described here was all of Israel. All the area of Israel, all those people from north to south, there were people who were flocking to Him and wanting to hear what He had to say, wanting to see what He was doing. They were thinking and saying, well, there's something strange going on and I want to see it. I want to hear it. I want to recognize it for myself. Maybe I myself have some kind of sickness or illness that's wrong with me, and I know that Jesus, there's these claims that He's performing miracles, that He's healing people. He's raising people from the dead. He's curing people of things that before it was thought was incurable. And so they're flocking to Jesus. And in this instance, Jesus still has a lot of popularity. But notice here that the committed followers of Jesus kept Him center stage. They did not take this opportunity to bring glory to themselves, but they simply kept Jesus center staged. And that's our responsibility as committed followers of Jesus Christ, is to keep Him center stage. If someone truly had the possibility of getting great glory out of the sacrifice and life of Jesus Christ, it was the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul. We could say others like Peter and the apostles could have brought themselves great glory. But the Apostle Paul had the opportunity, we might say, to gain popularity and even great glory from his following Jesus Christ and being an apostle. In fact, there were even certain groups of people who wanted to bestow upon him glory. And they wanted to think of him as something great and something awesome and something amazing. And then those group of people were the Corinthians. And if you've been with us on Sunday night, you know a little bit about the church at Corinth. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, we read there that some were going around, and Paul had heard of this, and to him this sounded strange. Paul heard that there were people at the church at Corinth who were saying, you know what? I am of Paul. I'm a follower of Paul. I'm a disciple of Paul. Paul is the one I listen to and lead. You can follow Apollos, you can follow Peter, but I am of Paul. And they were dividing over who they thought was the best teacher and who they wanted to say they were followers of. Now why would I not say in this time, well, I'm a follower of Paul? Well, Paul planted the gospel there. Paul brought the gospel to them. Paul was, in some circles, popular. He came and he performed miracles to them. And so it would be good for me to attach my name to Paul and to this great apostle. And so that's what we're doing. And notice what happened when Paul heard of this. He says in verse 12, now I say this, that each of you says, I'm of Paul, or I'm of Apollos, or I'm of Cephas, or I'm of Christ. Then notice this, verse 13, is Christ divided? Then notice this next question. Was Paul crucified for you? Or were you baptized in the name of Paul? He's saying, who is Paul? Who am I that you would try to bestow such glory and honor that's only due to the one who was crucified for you? He says, you've got the wrong person center stage. Anytime we take someone else, whether it's a preacher, an elder, a member, someone in the community, a public figure, a star, celebrity, any person or anything that we take and try to put center stage and put them in front of Jesus and push him out of the center stage, that person or that thing becomes an idol in our lives. It becomes now the object and desire of our lives when that place is only to be held by Jesus Christ. And if there is a place where Jesus has to stay center stage, it's all places, but if there is one place, it has to be the church of Jesus Christ. It has to be in the life of Christians. That Jesus Christ must be the first thing in our lives. If you go on looking, he continues to talk about this idea. And he starts talking about what he preaches. He says, I want you to know that when I come to you, I didn't preach myself, but what did I preach? He says in verse 18, he preached the message of the cross. He says to some people, that's foolishness. But did that affect Paul and what he preached? Paul said, I don't care if you think it's foolish. I'm keeping Jesus Christ center stage. I'm keeping his death for your sins here in the limelight. Not me, not Paul, but Jesus Christ and him crucified. Because that is the power of God for those who want to be saved. He says in verse 23, he says, but we preach Christ crucified. To the Jews a stumbling block, to the Greeks foolishness. If you notice in 1 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 2, he says, for I determined not to know anything among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. Folks, if we are going to be true, committed followers of Jesus Christ, if we're going to follow him anywhere and not just somewhere, we have to be willing to keep him first in our lives. We have to allow him to have the center stage. Here at the church at Hardin, if we're going to do anything, we have to put Christ first. He has to be the one thing that people see. Whatever they may see or think or talk about the church here at Hardin, I hope more than anything, they say about us that they put Christ first. They don't glorify themselves. They don't boast of themselves. They put Christ first. When you talk with them, you hear about Jesus and you hear about the wonderful sacrifice that he made. You don't hear them boasting about all the good deeds and all the things that they've done just so they can receive glory. You hear Christ and him crucified. They see him in our lives as we walk from day to day. We go from our jobs to our homes. They see Christ and they see him crucified. We've got to be willing to allow Jesus to lead us, but also to keep him center stage, to keep him first, to allow him to direct us, allow him to lead us. Then we can develop the kind of character that we need. In 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 5 through 11, Peter starts going on about how they are to add to their life, their Christian life, certain things. Add to your virtue, add to your faith, add to your knowledge, add to all these things, add brotherly love to it. You've got to keep on building and you have to keep on growing, and your character needs to keep improving. It needs to keep on going towards the character of Jesus Christ. Committed followers look at the life and character of Jesus and they mold themselves after it. We not only try to make our character like Christ, we try to make our service like Christ. In 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 10 and 11, he talks about how if we minister, we are to minister with that which God supplies. Everything we do, when God gives us a gift, when God does something for us and he increases my life somehow, whether it be through some kind of spiritual gift that I receive, right? If I received a gift of kindness, and I'm a kind person, where does that gift come from? It comes from God. How am I to use that? I'm to use it to serve other people with kindness. If I have received the gift of money, and money is certainly a gift, how am I to use it? I'm to use it to God's glory, but also to serve others. If I have received a gift, then I am to use it in the service of others. They followed Jesus. They offered their own service. If you look there in the text, Jesus is surrounded by this great multitude, people who have come from all over this area, and he looks to his small group of disciples and he asks them for some assistance. He asks them for help. He told them in verse 9, he says, so he told his disciples that a small boat should be kept ready for him because of the multitude, lest they should crush him. And what do you think the disciples did? They went and they got a boat, they kept it right there next to the seashore if Jesus needed it. Now we might look at this and say, well, you know what, that's not really all that big of a deal. In the area of the service of the church, we may look at some jobs that we have and may look at my role, and I might be the person that's just told to go get the boat. It doesn't seem very glorious, does it? Doesn't seem like a wonderful job, something to go home and to brag about. But was it something that Jesus needed? Yes. Was it something that Jesus wanted his disciples to do for him to be able to work properly? Yes. Folks, even in the simple everyday life things, it may be that Jesus has called me to go get a boat and to keep it close. I must be a committed, faithful follower, and in that instance, I go get the boat with all the strength and energy that I can. I go in the character and the service of Jesus Christ, and I get that boat, and I do it for the glory of Jesus Christ. There are many wonderful things that you're going to read in the Scriptures, you're going to read in your New Testament that Jesus calls us to do, and some of them are going to seem small. But how great of a work it will be if we take those small acts of service and we do them with our whole heart, keeping Jesus in mind and keeping Him on our focus. Today, we want you to be committed followers of Jesus. That's what we want. But there were others in this example here who were not necessarily committed to following Jesus. In fact, there were some who were just curious about following Jesus. There were the great multitudes, right, that came around from all over. Now, not all of those were committed followers of Jesus, but they were curious. Again, there was something strange going on, and when there's something strange happen, what do? We get curious. If something strange is happening outside your home, you get a little curious. You start seeing those emergency lights flashing outside your home, and you get a little curious. You start peeking out. You hear an argument maybe, and you start peeking out those windows because you're getting a little curious about what is happening. And we try to look into those things. Well, there were many people who were curious about Jesus, but that's about as far as it went. When we look at this example here, there were some who were following simply for the personal satisfaction of what Jesus had to offer. There were some who were simply following Him like He did when He fed the 5,000 in John chapter 6. And Mark read for us from John chapter 6 today. And there was some who simply were following Him because they wanted to be fed. They wanted another meal, and that's why they were following Jesus. They were interested in His ability to be able to offer to them some kind of physical food to fill their stomachs. And that's why they were following Him. They were curious about it. But when then Jesus would challenge them, like He did in Luke chapter 14, verses 25 through 27, when Jesus started challenging these people who were following Him into curious, when He challenged them to be committed followers, do you know what many of them did? They stopped following Him. When Jesus asked someone who was curious to take that next step and to become a committed follower, that's when they started backing off. I know that sometimes people enter into our building simply because they're curious. They want to know what's going on. They want to know why there's so many vehicles in the parking lot and how 100 people could be so interested in what's going on in one building. And so they might get curious. They might think that there's something here that's offered that they can't find anywhere else. And so they walk into the building curious. And I am so thankful for those curious people. I'm sure Jesus was, in fact, thankful that there were many people who were coming and were hearing the message. But just being curious is not enough to save your soul. There were many people who were curious at the teaching of the gospel. Acts chapter 17, the Athenians. Paul came to Athens, and he started preaching and teaching on the streets the gospel of Jesus Christ. And those religious elite in Athens wanted to hear. In fact, they called for Paul, and this is basically what they said. We're curious about what you have to say and about what you're teaching. And you know what he did? He sat there and told them, he says, I observed that you have all these idols to all these different gods, and you even have one erected to the idol of the unknown God. Just in case you may have forgot one, just in case you don't know about one, you erected an idol for that unknown God. He says, let me tell you about him. He's the one true God who created all people, all nations. He's in charge of all the boundaries. He's over everything. And don't you know that many who heard that, although they were curious, many who heard mocked Paul in his teaching. And even though some were curious, they even said later, we'll come back and we'll hear you on this matter again. They were curious, but yet they were not ready to make a decision. That's kind of like Felix. We read about Felix in Acts chapter 24, verses 25 through 24, when he and his wife, they call for Paul, who was in prison at that time, and they say, Paul, we want to hear what you have to say. So Paul starts speaking. He starts talking about things like the judgment. And Felix and his wife get a little scared, and they say, okay, we're going to send you away. We'll call for you at another time. They were curious. They heard the message of the gospel, but they were not ready to commit their lives to Jesus Christ. And as far as we know, they never did. We also know of a man named King Agrippa in Acts chapter 26. And Paul even told him, he says, I know you know a lot of these things, King Agrippa. I know that these things have not happened and they're outside of your knowledge. You know about these things. And you know what King Agrippa did after he heard the gospel? He said, almost you persuade me to be a Christian. Almost. How many people have become curious in Jesus Christ? They've heard the message, but yet they never make the decision to obey Jesus. Have you become curious in the gospel of Jesus Christ? Have you heard about this man who died on the cross for you? He took your punishment for your sins. He was crucified, he was buried, but he raised up from the dead victorious, and now offers you the chance to be saved. How many know of him, maybe even in our midst, but yet have not made the decision? They keep putting it off. They keep saying, you know what, I'll put it off till another time. I'll push this back until I'm ready to make that decision. Our hope is that when people who are curious of the gospel that even come into our midst, they get here, we hope to take them from curiosity to commitment. And that's what we want for you today. We want you to move from curiosity to commitment in Jesus Christ, to obeying the gospel. The gospel that they were told to go out and preach in the entire world. And Jesus said in Mark 16:16, he that believes and is baptized shall be saved. But he who does not believe will be condemned. We can't just keep putting it off, because eventually we will run out of time. And then we will be like those who are mentioned there at the end of the passage in verse 11 and verse 12, the unclean spirits. We will end up like the condemned, those who do not have a chance. There in the text it says that even these unclean spirits cried out before Jesus and said, you are the Son of God. They knew that Jesus was the Son of God, but yet they were condemned. They knew He was the Son of God, but they had made a decision that they were not going to follow the Son of God, that they were not going to be led by the Son of God, that their allegiance lied somewhere else than with Jesus. One day we will have to stand before the judgment seat of Christ, and one day every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus is the Christ. We will all have to give an answer for what we have done, whether good or bad. And will you make the decision to follow Jesus? Dear friends, in which group would you place yourself this morning in response to Jesus? Are you among those who are committed, a faithful disciple of Jesus Christ, willing to do whatever Jesus says, whether big or small, and following Him faithfully, putting Him at center stage? Are you among the curious who are simply interested? And if you're here and interested, that's great. We're not condemning you for being interested, but our hope and prayer is that you take that interest in Jesus Christ and you allow that to become a committed follower of Him, that leads you to obedience. Or are you among the condemned? Those who are determined to resist God and refuse Him. And I want you to know that that's not something that only happens to someone who has never obeyed the gospel. Because it's a sad realization to know that even some who have once obeyed Christ have now turned away from Him. And even though they know He is the Son of God, they have rejected Him and the sacrifice and salvation that He offers. Whether you are one who has not obeyed the gospel or one that has, we must commit ourselves to follow Jesus. The time for curiosity is over. We will either be saved or lost forever. And today is the day to make a choice. To choose whether or not you will accept the gift of salvation through Jesus Christ. If you have any need today, if you need to come forward, then won't you come as together we stand.